When the narrator of White on White, an anonymous art history doctoral student, travels to a European city to study Gothic nude sculptures of the 12th and 13th centuries, they find housing in an art apartment owned by Pascal, a professor of medieval studies, and his wife Agnes, a painter, both of whom live in a town several hours away. But when early on, Agnes unexpectedly shows up to paint in her studio upstairs, the narrator finds himself caught in the same trappings of representation and revelation they had intended to study, not late at night over the kitchen table, but rather in local archives. In graceful and spare prose, Savaş blurs the boundaries between creation and invention, power and vulnerability, as well as ultimately sanity and hysteria. To read White on White is to wonder, what does art reveal? What does it conceal? And how does scholarship, how do conversations, both key intermediaries in the novel, enrich or else suck dry these questions? What follows, I think, is a compelling and deeply psychological tale of identity, connection, and storytelling. And Ayşegül Savaş is the author of Walking on the Ceiling from 2019. She's published work in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, and The Guardian, among others. Savaş is originally from Turkey and she lives in Paris today. Ayşegül, thank you so much for being with us at the library this evening. Thank you. Thank you for coming out despite very obvious circumstances. Ayşegül, I'd like to start at the beginning, in some sense, and look at the kind of framing of the novel, and specifically look at how the narrator themselves frames it with a kind of vivid sentence that I think captures the spirit initially as we set out. So they say of the apartment and of this unnamed European city, in the year that I lived there, I had the sense of having stepped into another life. And then later, they say, still inside the territory of the dream, the same one I'd had since arriving in the city. So could you just describe a little bit, what is this other life, and why would the narrator describe it as the territory of a dream?
The other life is the life of Agnes, who, to my mind, is the main character of the book. And the structure of the book is told through a series of stories that Agnes relates to the narrator. So this sort of most obviously is the other life that the narrator steps into. But the narrator is also a researcher of Gothic nudes. And they're trying to understand why it is that nudity is such a rare topic. It really is in Gothic sculpture. Why it is that there are still some nudes in transitional moments in Gothic art. So I think this territory of the dream is also the threshold of being completely there, the threshold of having your identity stripped off, identity of gender, identity of nationality, which is, I guess, an obvious reason that the city isn't named, and we know very little about the narrator themselves.
Mm-hmm. We do know, you alluded to, and I had mentioned in my introduction, the project of this PhD student, the narrator, who, as you pointed out, is genderless, doesn't have a nationality. We can get into that, and certainly will. And we had both said 12th and 13th centuries, Gothic nude sculptures, and this is real. I mean, this is a real kind of gap in academic research. No, you consulted your friend Carl.
I did, yes, and I thank him in the acknowledgements, and I very cautiously say any mistakes I made are my own, because he did. My friend Carl, who's a medievalist, gave me the topic when I was looking for a framework for the novel. I knew that the novel would be about this woman, Agnes. I knew I wanted to write about a painter and the process of painting. And I thought, Agnes isn't in a position to tell her own story because she has lots of contradictory narratives about who she is. So I thought, if she were telling her story to someone else, that would be a great framework. So here we have the student. What should the student be studying? I thought I better not make this up. I'm not a scholar. Asked my friend Carl, and he said, there is you can do mourners, for example, in Gothic art. You could do Adam and Eve, expulsion from Eden, and then he said, or you could write this one topic that's never been written about. This is my dream PhD topic, and here's my proposal for a grant. And I thought, yes, I'll write about that. And he said, what I wanted to study when I was doing my PhD was, in studying the Gothic nudes, I wanted to study the iconography of the soul. And, this sort of, you yelled the most magic words you can tell a writer, the iconography of the soul. So I said, I'll take that, please.
Yeah. I want to think about how, as you say, kind of studying the attitude toward nakedness, rather looking at kind of clothing and what is hidden from sight as a way into thinking about nakedness kind of sets up the interpersonal stakes of the novel, which is to say, rather than looking at something that is, I suppose, naked or bare, looking at what is shown and what is kind of enrobed in the characters. Can you talk a little bit about that, I suppose, theme, if you like?
This is sort of the conundrum in art that, when you want to write about what is missing, or when you want to paint what is missing, you have to do it with substance, with something that you can hold. So it's an illusion that you can ever create space in art or create absence in art, right? Because it's done through words or through paint. And the way that I think the absences of this novel come through is through Agnes's stories. She's a compulsive talker, and she doesn't stop talking throughout the course of the novel. And you sort of begin to understand that there is something wrong because she's talking so much. And I would say that probably the absence there is everything that's weighing down her narrative and her increasingly hysterical speech.
Right. You described, Ayşegül did an interview, has done several interviews that I listened to as I prepared my questions, and you described Agnes's speech as kind of filling up the crevices of this landscape of the city and the problem. I really liked that description. So I was thinking about this PhD student's project as a kind of practical project, in the sense that we have the topic of the Gothic nudes, but it's also an intellectual project, because as a historian, the student is embarking on, as you write, the study of entering another person's consciousness. And you say, whether historical or not, this was as difficult a task as undoing one's own mind, unraveling each layer of thought with all its prejudices and assumptions. And so, as I kind of mentioned in the beginning, the student thinks that they'll be entering the kind of consciousness of the medieval era, enter Agnes and her speech, ongoing speech. And in some ways, the narrator meets Agnes before she even arrives, because the narrator encounters her paintings. And I just wanted to read this beautiful description of Agnes's art. You write, "The painting's formal restraint held back a sense of bewilderment, which I felt residing beneath the tangle of images. This, in a way, was my first meeting with Agnes." But who is Agnes, Ayşegül?
I think the narrator's sort of quest to understand the consciousness of the medievals who sculpted nudes is also the quest of every writer to understand the consciousness of their character. That you say, well, I'm going to put down this, create a woman, and she's going to be a painter, and she's going to be troubled, and she's going to act in these ways, and she's going to look this way. But whether or not you're really tapping into that person's consciousness is, it's a huge challenge, even when you've created the character yourself. I recently had received an email from a friend of mine who finished reading the novel, and she said, it was so refreshing to read the character of the narcissist. And I thought, who's the narcissist? And she meant Agnes, and I'd written Agnes with a huge amount of tenderness, even though she's a very troubling character. And then I thought, oh yes, she could be a narcissist. The job of the writer isn't to diagnose one's characters, just to say it's this type of person, and these are the types of ways in which this character would act. But why is it so? We don't know. Probably Agnes wouldn't know herself either, which is why we're allowing her to speak, so she comes to terms with some of the knots that she's been keeping throughout her life.
She's certainly a very naughty character, but just so we kind of get a full sense of, I think, all of the roles that she inhabits over the course of the novel. So she's the wife of Pascal, the professor's wife, and she says, kind of halfway through, I was very kind of consciously playing that role. She's a painter, she's a mother, she's friend / landlord, and that kind of dynamic and power dynamic's really interesting. She's elegant, articulate, tall, slender, motherly, captivating, and increasingly, as the novel goes on, haunting. And to understand Agnes a little more, as well as her relationship with her husband Pascal, I think we're going to hear the first reading from the novel. And so this is an excerpt of a conversation between Agnes and Pascal about their various interpretations of art, and we can talk a little bit more about some of the themes it brings up after.
Not long ago, Agnes said, she'd accompanied her husband on a tour of northern cathedrals to see different renditions of the wise and foolish virgins. The two of them stayed at bed and breakfasts, went on walks, immersed themselves in the northern landscape of green and stone that had been so formative in her own work. It was rare that she and Pascal traveled alone these days. From time to time, she joined his trips with students, though she often had the feeling that she was tagging along and that her views, if she expressed them, would sound simplistic. The students were friendly to her, making a point of sitting next to her at dinner, and she could not help falling into the role of professor's wife. She had known such women herself when she was a student. They were elegant and motherly, tending to the students with admiration while still considering them children. These wives told the students not to worry so much about their work, to get some rest, but listened attentively to the developments in their intellectual paths, never doubting that great things lay in store for them. Back then, it would not have occurred to Agnes that the women might not really be interested in the students at all, but were highly skilled in their performance. Anyway, she said, Pascal's most recent work was about the sculptural representation of the wise and foolish virgins in Gothic arts. You must be familiar with the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, Agnes said. 5 women remembered to bring oil for their lamps, while the other 5 forgot to do so. When the bridesmaids were summoned at midnight for the wedding, the foolish ones realized in panic that they had nothing to light their way, and asked the others to share their oil with them. But the wise woman left the foolish behind, and followed the bridegroom to the wedding. The lesson to be learned was that you must always be prepared for the day of judgment. But what sort of lesson was this, Agnes wondered, when the women were deemed wise for their smugness and their unwillingness to share? How were they judged fit to enter heaven when they had left their desperate friends behind? She'd always been bothered by the story, which was why she was particularly moved by one cathedral on their recent tour, where the 10 virgins stood in almost identical dress, with echoing features, as if they were indeed the same woman. Whatever moral the tale wished to emphasize about vices and virtues was undone with the sculptor's empathetic portrayal. It was clear that the women were wise or foolish out of no fault of their own, and that their fates could easily be reshuffled and any which way. Besides, the foolish ones might even have been more sympathetic, their shy smiles revealing a deeper humanity, unlike the haughty grins of the virtuous. Pascal thought that Agnes's interpretation was entirely wrong. In fact, he was irritated with her, going so far as to lead her one by one past the 10 statues, pointing out all the differences that mark the woman as separate and that declared a rigid morality carved deep into the sculptures. He drew her attention to a certain flare of cloth, often used in depictions of the Holy Mother, for example, or the foolish women's headdresses. Agnes didn't challenge him, though she doubted that the men and women entering the church all those centuries ago would notice the minute folds of cloth suggesting vice and virtue, rather than a line of young women who were equal in their loveliness and humanity. Pascal should never hear me say this, she said, smiling slyly. She sometimes had the impression that he was dismayed with her opinions on art. I told her that I agreed with her interpretation of the statues. I didn't think in the least, I added, that her reading of art was superficial.
I really loved this particular passage, in part because I think it offers a really moving theory of art. And what I really loved about this novel is that you offer, over the course of it, various theories of art by way of Agnes. And in this particular reading, it seems to me that she's making the case that art is reductive and compassionate. And the other reason I think I really liked this passage too is that it highlights this kind of ongoing tension in the novel of art as interpreted by the artist and then art as interpreted by the professor, her husband. Can you speak a little bit about what, on the one hand, I suppose, is the value of a kind of cool interpretation of the PhD student or the art history professor, and what is the value of a kind of more passionate relationship to art?
I think one of the points that Agnes was also making in her reading is that she's saying art is made for people to see and to understand what they're meant to understand, right? At the same time, it's hard to know the consciousness of the 12th century sculptures who made this art. So, you know, what sort of virtue or vice were they trying to communicate? In many ways, the story in the book is the story of a marriage and the way that a marriage falls apart. Not to give too much away, but Pascal's an academic and Agnes is a painter, so they have very different ways of looking not just at art, but also at the world. And one of the questions I was really interested in was the messiness of compassion. The narrator is also an art history student. They're very factual in the way that they see the world, and they start off by being quite removed from Agnes and from detached, I guess, emotionally detached. At the same time, they're listening to Agnes and giving Agnes many hours to talk and express herself. So I wondered, you know, is this sort of detachment, very cool detachment, a way of being compassionate, or does compassion require some sort of messiness that the moment you see the person in front of you suffering, do you need to be tainted, or do you need to get involved in their mess in order to be fully compassionate? Because we see Agnes falling apart and the student doesn't take a step closer.
Yeah, I've got some great quotes kind of on this point. So this is early on. Agnes says and she really is just holding forth through much of the novel about her marriage, about her children, about former nannies, her parents, her cousin, her work, etc. So she says early on, I tell you these stories and I can't tell whether you want to hear them. So no reply. Later, and we've said that she kind of unravels, but we'll get to that. But you can kind of hear it as in the kind of progression here. So this is a little bit later. She says, I keep talking and talking, she said, her eyes still closed. I talk and I talk and I talk, and I don't know what you're thinking. And then she adds, it's difficult to tell whether you're exceedingly polite or willfully blind. And actually, I read Ayşegül's debut novel to kind of prepare for this as well, called Walking on the Ceiling. It's fantastic. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it too. And I found this quote last night that I thought really gets to the point of this silence, essentially. So this is a line from the end. And you wrote, "There are many ways of hurting without words. It's silence that shapes us."
Alice, the literary detective. I think this is definitely a recurring theme in my writing. That I write about the ways in which people hurt one another, not overtly by, with a physical punch or with hurtful words, but actually by holding back or by being silent, by not speaking, and the ways in which these silences are interpreted. And in White on White, earlier drafts, the narrator was speaking, and the narrator did have a life, a background story, and I thought, not necessarily thematically, but as I revised, I had a sense that, I wanted to go a little bit further, and I wanted to make things really weird. And I thought, what if the narrator didn't say anything? And what if, we were faced with someone who, looking at another's suffering, just stays silent and stays still? Is this a monstrous thing to do? Or is this itself a form of humanity and creating space? And I was just sort of interested in also the stylistic limitations of this, how, the narrator's in the apartment for a year. It's very hard not to have a character speak for an entire year when they're living with someone. So, what are the ways in which I could manipulate this and have it feel believable, but also quite strange?
So we don't learn much about the narrator, although, and we spoke about this last night, many of the interviews that Ayşegül has done, the interviewers, and I also totally kind of fell into this trap, they assumed that the narrator was a woman. Can you speak a little bit about this, not trap, but kind of assumption that's happened? And I rewatched the interview with one of the interviewers, who I have to name them, and I watched as they said again and again, she and her, and I was watching your reaction.
I mean, this has been sort of challenging with the reception of this novel, because I do these wonderful interviews, and I don't want to say, well, you read it wrong, and it's what makes you think it's a woman, but it was.
It does make you think so.
It does, but this did interest me. I understand why someone would read the narrator as a woman, but the moment I say there are no markers, there are really no gender markers in the book, there are ways in which we have learned gender. There are ways in which we think only a woman will listen to hours of another's stories. Only a woman will be polite enough not to step away. Women share stories with one another. Women share very intimate details from their past, about a cousin or this nanny that we used to have. So maybe these are the ways in which we think. And also there is a type of doubling or mirroring going on in the book. So we know that Agnes is a woman, so we think the person looking at her or mirroring her must also be a woman. But all of this, again, is assumed. So I'm a bit interested in how the reader makes the story, or how the reader brings in material to the blank moments of the book.
The white canvas. You mentioned the doubling and a kind of another stylistic or almost formal limitation, or I suppose challenge that you gave yourself, is that you wanted to write a ghost story. Can you talk a bit about this aspect?
More than a challenge, it was actually sort of an indulgence. This is one of my favorite genres. Wouldn't it be so fun to write a ghost story, or to have the feel of a ghost story and something that we can't name? Which is one of the reasons that I decided not to name the city, and to have it, because then you can really go all out. You can say, well, I'm going to give all the ghost story elements to this city and this apartment, and no one can call me out on, being factually incorrect. And the other reason is, for a writer, it's very fun not to have to, conform to the rules. I'm currently editing a story that's set in Rome, and I'm just on Google Maps and like, can you really walk there in 30 minutes? Can you have gelato at the spot that I, made up, but it's a real city? If it's a ghost story and it has a fantastical element, there's nothing supernatural, then I'm, as a writer, free to invent.
Should we read the second passage? So this is very much towards the end of the novel. This is the long-awaited arrival of Pascal. So this is the husband of Agnes, who comes in and reveals, although we've kind of learnt, I suppose, about these kind of aspects of her character, he says many things kind of explicitly that we have been kind of suspecting over the course of the novel. And it's also just interesting to finally meet him after hearing about him in all these various iterations through Agnes's storytelling.
So I'm going to read, it is from the end, I'm not going to read anything that gives away what happens. Coming home one afternoon, I found Pascal sitting in the kitchen. I gasped when I saw him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I thought you were aware I'd be here." He was tall and bulky with a tangle of dark hair. The features of his face protruded with character. The face of an artisan, I thought, or a monk. I hadn't imagined that he would look awkward, even cumbersome. He got up from the chair and extended his hand. "I'm sorry," he said again, by way of introduction. He was in the city for a seminar and wanted to pick up some things from the apartment. He'd mentioned this to Agnes, and they'd set a time when she would be out, so he had assumed that she would pass on a message. But it was quite possible that there had been a miscommunication. He seemed to have a knack for misunderstanding her these days. "If you'll tolerate me for a bit longer, I'll just look through the bookshelves and be out of your way." He looked around at the kitchen cabinets, as if he expected to see the books there. I asked him if he would like something to drink, though it was still quite early. "I'd like nothing more," Pascal said. I poured 2 glasses of white wine that Agnes had left for me in the fridge and brought the rest of the bottle to the living room, where Pascal was already examining the books. He made a small pile beside him on the floor. He was holding an old book of folk tales. He opened its gray cloth cover and ran his hand down its marbled first page. Then he closed it and put it back on the shelf. She has such a knack for finding these things. I might not know, he told me, that he and Agnes had lived in this apartment during the first years of their marriage. It had been a very different place then, certainly less refined, but full of their life together. Then as now, it was Agnes who'd arranged everything, though not in the way of a young wife, with practicality and overt decorations. She had a horror of those types of homes, not unlike the home of her own parents, and had always said that she would rather live in cold austerity than in sentimental clutter. Pascal sometimes thought that all of Agnes's artistic sensibility was in reaction to her upbringing, to creating a life different from that of her parents. Still, he went on, she managed to endow every place she entered with something of herself, faint and fragile. She was like a bird in everything that she did, collecting and dispersing, lining things up in an odd fashion. If I'd ever seen Agnes's paintings, I would understand that they reflected this essential containment of her character, its nest-like quality. Her work was hypnotic for this reason, he said, and it revealed something profound about Agnes's interaction with the world, carefully enclosing her space and drawing boundaries. "So, have you?" he asked. "Have you seen Agnes's paintings?" I told him I'd seen 1 or 2. "And wouldn't you say that they're fascinating studies of containment? Their power, in my opinion, comes from what they don't reveal, just like Agnes herself." He came to sit at the edge of the couch and poured more wine in my glass, and then in his. He looked at the bottle. "Agnes's pick," he said. "Wasn't it true of all art," I asked, "that its power lay as much in absence, in the deliberate choice of what was left out, as in what was revealed?" "Precisely," Pascal said. "But Agnes can't accept even this simple fact. She insists that my interpretation of her paintings has never been accurate." Over the years, she'd become increasingly private about her work. Whether there was ambition at the root of it or fear, he didn't quite know. Perhaps a resentment he'd never fully understood. Whatever the reason, she refused to let him into dialogue with her painting.
Thank you, Ayşegül. I think we had picked this passage because it highlights class in the novel. And I was surprised, actually. I was listening to the other interview we had talked about, and you had said in that interview that the class hadn't come up over the course of your kind of publicity. Well, why do you think that is?
I don't know. One interviewer actually said it might not have come up because class doesn't exist in the publishing world, especially in the American publishing world. So this might be one reason that there is a certain blindness to class. And to me, it is also, one of the big traumas of Agnes's life is that she is married into another social class, and Pascal has asked her, even though in this passage, he's denying it, he's asked her to leave her life behind, to only visit her parents if he's not there, to, not have anything to do with this very cluttered house of his in-laws. The way that the two of them see class, Agnes and Pascal, is very different. I think and this is again one of the knots of the novel, that Agnes is coming to terms with what has been done to her, but also what she's done to herself, what she's accepted as the wife of this man, as the mother of her children, what she's left behind. And this is a sort of reckoning, the moment of the novel where she really has to face her own decisions and the blank canvas of this very elegant woman that she's created. And then so it's a little bit difficult for her to be angry at Pascal too, because she has willingly participated in the creation of this
of his fantasy of her,
of his fantasy of her fantasy of herself, the person that she always wanted to be, and the type of woman that she wanted to look like. And late into her life, she realizes that perhaps this has come at a cost of losing friendships and losing family and losing a sense of belonging or identity.
Yeah, there's this really horrible scene early on when they've met and they've kind of had this amazing love affair. He's fallen completely in love with her and all of her grace and elegance. And so she brings him home to her parents, and her parents are really excited to meet him and prepare this great feast. And they're very effusive with the food and their kind of emotions. And he is really horrified and quite rude, and eats the lunch and is very kind of taciturn. And they ask him loads of questions and he says yes, no, goes upstairs and doesn't even unpack his bag and then leaves early the next day.
And I think, this is one of those moments where Agnes can switch between classes, and she has a sense of, a larger sense of the world, whereas Pascal is very narrow in the types of places he's inhabited, and he's in complete shock when he goes to Agnes's house. And he thinks, wait, this isn't you. This isn't the woman that I met and the person I've signed up to be with.
You mentioned, you keep mentioning all these knots. Imagine she just needs a massage. Some kind of, no, that's a joke. But I guess one question I had was, because of all these knots and because of all these tensions inside of her, do you think that the unraveling or the undoing of this constructed life is inevitable? I mean, was it inevitable when you started writing her as a character? And if it didn't come out now, I mean, when would it have come out, I suppose?
Well, formally it's inevitable because it's a novel, right? That, we have to tell the story. If it was evitable, I think, if it wasn't supposed to happen, there would be no book. So I knew, setting up the character of Agnes, that she would be unraveling in the course of the novel. Was it inevitable for a woman like her that she would, at some point in her life, come to terms with how constructed her identity is? I think that isn't inevitable, and that you can absolutely go through your life believing that the constructed self is really who you are and who you want it to be, even if it's come at great cost, or never questioning who you are. I think for what makes a difference for Agnes is in some ways painting perhaps, or the fact that she's an artist. And in order to, I think she keeps on thinking that the art she's doing is superficial and that it's gimmicky and it's not really deep in some ways. And it lacks depth because it's always been in imitation of something else. It's always been in imitation of what she thinks, you know, high art should look like. And she does have to come to terms with something in herself and who she is in order to go a little bit deeper into her own painting. And I guess the setup of the novel is such that Agnes is in a very confined space with not exactly a stranger, but also not exactly a friend. So it is a framework in which she can begin to present herself without any preconceived notions of who she is. Because up until then, she's been a mother, and there's an idea of what a mother does. Up until then, she's been a professor's wife, so it means that, she's kind to the students on trips. She's been a wife, and that means that she looks elegant, she looks the way she is. She has done all of these things, and now for the first time, she's Agnes, and with a young tenant in her apartment. So I think she has this liminal space to express her identity.
It's interesting how your description of this kind of undercurrent of energy somehow maps onto her conception of really great art. And I really love this kind of meditation on her theories of art. And so she describes art, she observes, I'm just quoting you here, that what distinguished the work of the masters from their contemporaries was a lack of perfection. So she's telling this to the narrator. Perfection was produced externally with the visual and tactile skill of a craftsman, whereas the greatest art was dragged out from deep within and appeared disturbed alongside its flawless counterparts. She adds later, what made the works interesting was their slight tilt. The ordinary world rocked off balance. And then of her own art, she says, also is looking to drawings from her college years, she says that they were honest and alive, entirely different from her controlled paintings today.
Well, that basically sums up what I said.
In the last 5 minutes, Ayşegül, should we talk about craft? Last night on the phone, Ayşegül said, I love talking about my craft and my process. So
I did also say I just like when writers listening to.
Yes. Exactly. Not your own craft necessarily. I would like to quote. I suppose one question I had was, what were some of kind of the influences that you think found their way into the novel? So this is actually a quote from the novel, and this is Agnes saying to the narrator early on, there was something invigorating about sharing a workspace with another person. She could almost feel my project's influence on her own. So I was wondering, in that kind of line of thought, with whom were you sharing workspaces with while you were writing your novel?
Two books in particular have a very direct influence on White on White. One is the painter Celia Paul's autobiography, Self-Portrait, and the other is Yuko Tsushima, a Japanese writer's one of two novels, I believe, Territory of Light. In different ways, Territory of Light structurally was very much in conversation with this book. It's told in 12 chapters. It spans the seasons. And Celia Paul's Self-Portrait really was my education about, the life of a painter and the concerns of a painter who's also a mother and who's also a wife. So these books were huge.
And then in terms of craft, we just tell us a little bit for all the writers in the audience, what is your process like? I heard an interview that you gave, and you said early mess, early mess, early mess. And then finally, a kind of late epiphany as pieces fall into place.
And the terrible thing is the last thing in memory is the final epiphany. So you end with that and you think, I can do this again. And then you start writing something else and you think, wait, there is no story. It's extremely messy. I have no idea where I'm going. And then that goes on for a few years. And then you have this final, oh, this is a story and I can pull it together. And then, and it starts again. My process really is this. More tangibly speaking, I would say that if it's a lot of reading, and that's sort of probably 90% of my process is that in the time that I'm trying to casting for ideas and trying to solidify an idea, I'm just reading, and I'll read at least 4 hours a day, often more, and sort of my message to the world is, please, a book come to save me. And, I'll read, so many books, 4 books a week, 5 books a week. And I'll say, okay, I'm still waiting. And then sometimes something will click and I'll say, I'm in tune. And I want to follow this direction, or this is showing me the way to what I want to do myself. And then when I start writing, I try to be very strict about the writing, write very little, but write every single day, just so that I'm immersed in that world. And, sort of the regular thing that you're told by all writers, that don't criticize your work until you finish it, and just keep going and try to, I say, it's like walking through mud for a very long time and saying, yes, it's mud. And, it has to be one. There's no, you never write a good book in a first draft. And then at the last very enjoyable moment, when I know what the story is and I'm editing, I read much less and I have a completely illusory sense of, being on top of it and being able to pull together the plots and the structure, and it lasts a very short time.
I'd like to, before we open it up to questions and comments, so please ask questions and comments imminently. I just wanted to read Ayşegül, a final quote that I thought was so beautiful, and it's about painting, but I wondered if you felt similarly while you were writing. So this is Agnes talking about painting, and she says to the narrator, of course, the process was like digging deeper inside a single moment. Within every state of silence, there was another final one. The more she grew attuned to it, the more she found places to explore within. Eating became slower and walking too. So much happened in the simple acts, but they were feasts to observe.
I think that's probably how I would wish my writing was. It's a very meditative state that I'm describing there. And of course, that is sort of where I'm trying to get to. And that's sort of seeing your own thoughts very directly and clearly. Whereas a lot of the time, you're wobbling and you don't have a sense of your own thoughts and you can't really see them in perspective. But there are, moments of stillness like that where you have it and you think, I can hold on to this and I can go a little bit deeper. Very fleeting moments.
Thank you, Ayşegül. Can we have a big round of applause? So, are there any questions or comments? Yes. Also, for anyone on Zoom, we'll get to your questions and comments too.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much for that. I'm interested in this idea of a writer talking about a painter. And were there artworks that you were referencing when you were getting into Agnes's mind? And if so, were you engaged with any form of ekphrasis? Or was it a kind of fictional ekphrasis where you actually made up the objects and the artworks and then sort of wrote from there?
For both the narrator and Agnes were looking at medieval art. And in that, I was very much looking, visiting cathedrals and looking at sculptures, and then abstracting them a little bit just because it's geographically unspecific. For Agnes's art, I had an idea of what her art looked like. And I had some painters, which I'm hesitant to name just because they were guiding, but then it did end up being Agnes's own work. And I thought, this is the type of painter, which is something I love actually about reading about art in fiction, because you can really imagine it in so many ways. And often, you go and look up a real painting and you think it's completely different from how I imagined. There's a pleasure to conjuring painting in prose.
Thank you. Yes.
Good, thank you for the presentation. I have a question about the title. In a Black Lives Matter context, you see a title white on white, and you think that's what's speaking. In an artistic context, you say, oh, there were a few American painters a long time ago who painted white on white. I sort of have a sense that it's neither of those.
Yes, there was no racial connotation. And I also wasn't quite thinking about the white paintings, I think, from many different schools, from Russian as well as American. This artwork exists, but I did want to think about, I think White on White as a title came about around the time that I knew the narrator's research topic and that it would be an unnamed city. And I thought it would be fitting for Agnes's character as someone who doesn't have a very transparent relationship with herself, that white objects on a white canvas would be appropriate for who she is and that sense of obscurity.
4 hours of reading a day. I think we're all very jealous. And so your style is obviously developed enough that it's not contaminated by what you're reading, but I know you're also a teacher. How do you, what advice would you give to someone who's learning to write to not be so influenced by the styles that they're reading if they're doing that kind of preparatory work?
I am influenced by styles very much. And I can tell when I read a first draft, I say, oh, this is when I was reading so-and-so, and this is when I was reading so-and-so, and it keeps switching. But then you sort of comb over those drafts, and you always know deep down, this is where I was copying this writer that I admire. And there are moments where, the sentences are free of those influences, and you say, this is probably, my own style or my own voice. To students, I would say they should, it really is the only training to become a writer, I think, is to read. And I think the work of a writer is to be reading constantly. It's not, leisure time in which you're reading. It really is work hours that you're reading and, creating the foundation for what you will write. Probably to students, I would also say the stickiest books are contemporary books, just because the tone is very easy for us to associate with. And I think that's why a lot of contemporary fiction does sound similar, because it's written in same voice. I would say read as far back and as geographically diverse as you possibly can, and from all sorts of different eras, as opposed to the immediate circle of writers surrounding you, as a way of creating, if you're reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, I don't think you'll sit down to write, a short story set in San Francisco and, start with like in the great city of Uruk or whatever, right? That it will bleed into, is that how it bleeds? That might have been, but it informs your writing in a deeper way rather than just sort of syntax or mannerisms.
I think that highlights the question we had on Zoom from Matthew Keating. So apart from the Epic of Gilgamesh, Ayşegül, are there any books you would recommend any reader must read? Apart from your book.
I wish I'd prepared for this question and then I'd come with a reading list. No, right now I'm going to say no. I have my own favorite books and books I think are the best of the best. But my husband and I were discussing recently, we looked at the 100, greatest books of all time on The Guardian, and then we looked at the same list on the New York Times, and one was all American books and the other one was all English books. And we thought some of these books are so completely random, just because someone came up with these 100 forgotten English classics really doesn't mean anything about, the wealth of world literature. So I think that question is difficult to answer. And I hope I'm never in a position to make a list like that, where it has to be like, fit all of them in and not get scolded by a university professor for having missed, Henry Fielding or whatever.
Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk more about your process for naming your characters, particularly Pascal and Agnes. If you spent a long time making sure they were Pascal and Agnes, or if you considered other names or not naming them, etc.
Thank you. That's a great question. I spent a long time thinking of names, partly because a lot of my fiction is in geographically nondescript places. So it has to be names that work for different countries, but also carry some sense of, Europeanness or whatever class they may belong to. With Agnes, I had lots of different versions of her name, and then I like Agnes because I guess because of Agnes Varda. Or Agnes Martin. So there was the idea of an artist, and I'm troubled but deep woman. I think this is what I was going for. But I have sort of a narrowing roster of geographically ambiguous names that I now realize I've used and reused. So I'm always on the lookout for great names that could, work for several countries. If you have any ideas. Yes.
Thank you so much. I was interested in this question of confession. I think especially since you mentioned Celia Paul, which whose book I read, at least in part, as a kind of attempt to kind of recapture her own narrative after having been framed and narrated by others, including her husband. And yet, in the course of your conversation, it seems like, I think it's a way we often tend to think of self-expression as kind of necessarily empowering, right? And so I was interested in your conversation. It seems like the more Agnes speaks, actually, the less power and control she has, and it's in fact the narrator who never speaks at all, who kind of wrest control in a way over that narrative. So I was wondering if that was something you were thinking about, the kind of the power of exploitation in confession.
Yes, definitely. We do have this idea that the moment, everyone should express themselves, and the moment people are given the medium to express themselves, they will do so fully and transparently with full authority, whereas people often are strangers to themselves too. And when they begin speaking, they're surprised by what they say, or they may be frustrated and they think, I'm not really getting at expression is very, very difficult, and honest and direct expression, as all writers know, is even more so. So I think at the beginning of the book, Agnes is thrilled to have the space to talk and to present herself. and appear quite charming and elegant. But the more she speaks, the more I think she begins to understand that, you know, she can't always cover things up. One of the things that really struck me in Celia Paul's book was the way in which she was so honest, without making an excuse or without offering an explanation for why she did the things that she did, and talking about some very dark material. It's completely different from Agnes, because Agnes does have a sense of wanting to hide certain aspects of who she is and what's happened to her in life. And her narrative begins to crack as the book goes on.
Actually, we have another question on Zoom. This is from Jonathan Levy, who writes, Ayşegül, do you know Jonathan? Yeah, okay. He says, Ayşegül, as you know, I'm a big fan of your writing in this novel, but I must confess also being guilty of reading the narrator as female. Did you not have a visual image of the narrator as you wrote, one that implied gender?
This is really interesting because I know Jonathan is a writer as well, and Jonathan comes up with very vivid visual descriptions of his characters before he continues. I had a very vivid idea of what Agnes looked like, and the narrator describes Agnes in detail throughout the novel. So Agnes's physical description was important to me as part of who she is and how she presents herself to the world. The narrator, it's interesting because there was a draft in which the narrator was a man, and there was another draft in which the narrator was a woman. And when I decided to remove that, I thought this should be irrelevant. And it should, the lens of the book should be turned towards Agnes. You know, you don't look at a photograph and you never think, well, what does the photographer look like? You look at the subject. So I did, you have an idea of what sort of a photographer this is, what sort of angles they use, what sort of emotional direction they have, but you don't necessarily think, is the photographer a man or a woman, and how do they dress? So this was, I think, probably how I thought about the narrator in the later drafts.
Thank you, Ayşegül. Can we have one more round of applause? I'd like to also thank the audience for your engagement and for your wonderful questions. Thank you for joining us at Evenings with an Author, sponsored by Grow at Annenberg.